Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you listen to this podcast. Uh, for Josh right now, it's currently about 9:15 a.m. So if he doesn't sound like he's fully put together, it's because he's not. It's a Monday. Um,
This is why we record on Thursdays usually.
yeah, that way he at least gets 4 days worth of recuperation from the brain dump that often is a Sunday morning. Um, anyway, I'm one of your hosts, Pastor Benjamin Olschlager, aka Pastor Ben, uh, out here in Lake Orion, Michigan. With me again, as always, Pastor Josh Laborious of Edgewater Lutheran Church in Eastvale, California. Um, and today is July 3rd. And so Josh wanted to do something. Oh, by the way, this is last week we recorded an episode to be released tomorrow,
Tomorrow.
the 4th of July. And we, brilliantly said, this is season 4, episode 1, and then got on this call today and decided, you know what? We're going to scrap that. Well, we're not going to scrap that. We're going to release it a week late. Um, and this will now be season 4, episode 1.
Or depending on how I'm feeling when I listen, the last episode of season 3. So if we didn't make explicit reference to the chronology in the episode last week, we have now. So, but as is the theme of this show, we do what we want, and you can't stop us.
Yeah. And sometimes we can't stop ourselves. So, um,
Like this specific thing, that there might be some questionable wisdom in picking up this topic, and but we're going to do it anyway because we can't help ourselves. So this episode is going to release on July 4th. If you're listening to this, that means it's at least July 4th, depending on how prompt you are on listening to Man Buns and Jesus episodes. And we figured it would be appropriate to talk about America, kind of. Uh, More specifically, how do we as Christians, um, how do we deal with our country? How do we deal with our kind of patriotism? When does it become idolatry? Like, where's the line where, okay, it's okay to celebrate our country up until a certain point, or is there a point? And well, spoiler alert, there is a point. There's definitely a point where it's like, this is too much celebration of our country. Um, and what I would love to kick this off with is
what I would love to kick this off with is you don't need to set off so many fireworks. My dog is terrified of them.
I was
So,
actually
like,
just gonna say fireworks are perfectly acceptable within range celebration.
I'm mostly joking. This is purely driven out of selfish intent, but
You set off as many explosions in the sky as you want on 4th of July.
hmm, be smart.
Colorful celebratory explosions. Let's maybe.
People like lose limbs and fingers and lives every year on 4th of July.
Don't be stupid about it, right? Like, read all the safety information, be an adult with some sense of wisdom, and have a designated firework user, like one would have a designated driver, right? If you're 12 beers in, you should not be lighting off fireworks. And I haven't looked into this because I don't actually care very much. I would be curious, of all of those injuries, how many of them involved someone who was intoxicated? Because I'd be willing to bet,
98%.
yeah, a fair number of them, it's probably because someone was they were
I'm
combining fire and alcohol, and that's a
I
bad.
made up that number, but it feels right.
It feels like it might be on point. Um, this episode's not all about fireworks, but I guess that's as good a place as any to start. Um, I've struggled with this at a place that I've been previously. Every morning, because it was a
Are you
school.
moving on from fireworks?
I am, unless you
Because I
wanted.
do want to say something else about fireworks.
Oh, by all means. Oh,
Okay,
and
so
as a note, fireworks don't bother my dog at all. So
your dog is also like the most fish out of water dog that you could ever experience. It's a husky living in Southern California.
yes, a lazy husky, no less, which is an aberration.
Yes. Um, anyway, the point that I wanted to make about fireworks is I mean, there is still a line. I did my vicarage in Omaha, Nebraska, which for 5 days every year basically legalizes everything firework related. Um, some of the best firework shows that I've ever experienced. I got to be there for two Fourth of Julys, and some of the best firework shows that I ever experienced were those two Fourth of Julys, sitting next to the closed frozen yogurt shop near my apartment in Omaha, and just watching the neighborhood across the valley from me go bonkers. Um, but I also know how much some of those people spent on fireworks every year.
That's fair. There's probably a point where it becomes a stewardship issue.
Yes. So set off as many shooty boom booms as you want, as long as it doesn't impact your ability to love and serve your neighbor through wise uses of your resources.
Yeah,
My
that's.
pastor's neighbor that had an annual firework budget of $10,000. Yeah,
I don't have an annual anything budget of $10,000.
yeah,
I guess
that was a
rent.
bit
I pay more than 10 grand a year in rent.
that was a bit much. Um, and I think anyone listening to this podcast will probably agree with me. That seems like a bit much.
Just yeah, yeah. So where I grew up, Warner Robins, Georgia is an Air Force town. Like Robins Air Force Base is right there. Um, so the city put on a huge fireworks show every year, and like it was the show that was broadcast on Armed Forces Network. Like it was a big deal. Um, and for most of like while I was in high school, middle school, what they did is they had a county-wide football stadium. Three high schools shared this stadium, gigantic stadium, right? Seats many thousands of people, and across the street was a practice field for one of the schools. So what they would do is they would have a concert and they'd have essentially a big party in the football stadium, and then they'd fire off fireworks across the street from the practice field because it was a big open space where they could do their setup and kind of be safely away from everyone and buildings and stuff like that. That was really cool. And I wouldn't be opposed to more of that where maybe you as an individual don't go buy $10,000 worth of fireworks, but maybe some organization says, we're going to throw a party and have a fireworks show, which I know is done. Like that's done all over the country. So fireworks, good place to start. Everybody likes fireworks. That's not true. Everybody doesn't like fireworks. I like fireworks. Ben likes fireworks. Ben's dog does not like fireworks. So, um, in any case, going back to the anecdote I was teeing up, there was a school, and every morning, as a lot of schools do, they start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and then they followed it by the Christian Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the cross.
Yeah, well, I pledge allegiance
To the cross of our
to
Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
no, I think it was to the Christian flag.
Interesting. That one I don't know.
I mean, I don't remember it, but I kind of wrestled with how seriously I can take the words of the Pledge of Allegiance. because, and like, I don't have any I'm not anti-America, right? I do love this country. I feel really blessed that I get to live here. However, I say I'm pledging allegiance to the flag and to the country it stands for. Um, that's a conditional allegiance, because if push comes to shove and it's my faith for whatever reason and whatever circumstances put me at odds with the country, my allegiance does not lie with the country I live in. It lies with the faith I profess and the God behind that. And that's something I wrestled with. I was like, I don't know if I can honestly speak this, because even if that's purely theoretical, right? Even if I go my entire life and there's never a situation where those two are completely irreconcilably at odds, my words aren't fully honest if I'm saying that, right? Because there is a condition where my allegiance won't hold. Um, and there's some things that happen, and there are some ways people talk about their country that I'm curious if push came to shove, is your allegiance with your nation or is your allegiance with your faith? And even if it is with your faith, if things you're doing or saying are leading me to ask that question, we might have a problem with the witness that we're putting out. And Ben, yeah, you can jump off whenever you want, but Ben, I think it's you who told me this statistic that like someone found that people's beliefs align, like when they surveyed a bunch of people and people's beliefs align more closely with their political parties, with their view of what the nation should be, than it did with their church. So like you might say, oh, no one would choose nation over church, but the reality is, the lived reality is, a lot of people do.
Mhm.
um
I think it was something like 90% of people that claim to be both religiously devout and um, have a political party, their beliefs more closely align with their politics than their faith. Um, Granted, there are groups within most major religions where you can find a branch of that religion that almost perfectly mirrors a political party.
Right. Well, and even that study, the statistic is probably skewed, right? Because of how you're defining. Because, like, if you were to ask me, I wouldn't be included in that study because I am not a card carrying member of any political party. Like, if you were to ask me, I'd say I don't identify myself with one,
Yeah,
regardless of whether or not I tend to vote one way or the other. I'm not beholden to it. So, like, the statistic is probably skewed, but there's still this reality that, is your country more important to you than your faith? And whether or not that's the reality, what's the perception? Like, when you're taking actions to celebrate or to talk about your country, when are you communicating to people that your country is more important to you than anything else?
yeah. I think maybe an interesting place to kind of start to think about this is posture. Um, as I sit here and slouch. Um, and I think about this in terms of just what I've seen lately. So, as a big baseball fan and specifically a big Minnesota Twins fan, the Twins were here in Detroit a week and a half ago, and my wife and I went to a couple of games. Um, and both times we walked in as the national anthem was being sung. Um, and as a guy, I'm asked to stand and remove my hat, um, and face the flag. Um,
which is sometimes kind of hard to find. As a side
yeah,
note, I've been to a lot of venues where they're like stand and face the flag, and I'm like, where can we
I
get a sign that points me to it?
I kind of vaguely pointed in a direction of the outfield because I don't remember exactly where it's at Comerica Park, the Tigers' home field. But um, I thought about after that, just about everyone around me was doing the same thing, and like we are culturally trained to stand and reverence the flag when we hear the national anthem or when we speak the Pledge of Allegiance, which I'm guessing most of us did in grade school. Um,
And with because I want to be I don't want anyone to hear things we're not saying. Um, we're not necessarily like it's not a bad thing to play the national anthem. I don't
no,
even really like there's nothing really wrong with standing and facing the flag. But it can communicate or like the cultural conditioning that Ben is talking about is something we should maybe be more cognitively aware of. Because while
yeah,
that's not harmful, um, something that could be more harmful is are we doing things we shouldn't or treating people we shouldn't because of they're a perceived threat or because they're outsiders to that?
or even just like to me, it was striking that we're so good at culturally conditioning ourselves to that, but culturally conditioning ourselves to um, like a similar level of reverence in a worship setting is far more difficult
That's an interesting truth.
because like you go to a ball game, every drunk frat bro is standing at attention facing the flag during the national anthem. And when I encourage people to stand up as we listen to the gospel, I'm not saying every Sunday and I'm not saying every person, but I can find more people in the congregation that I serve here that on occasion are not particularly reverent to that situation, um, more easily than I can find somebody who's not reverent to the flag at a ball game.
That's a crazy comparison, but I think it's spot on. Um, oh geez. I'm trying to decide whether or not I'm gonna cross this bridge. Oh, we're gonna do it.
We're crossing the Rubicon, folks.
We're someone might
That was
smack me after this.
that
Um,
was a history reference that I don't know if anyone's gonna catch.
I now I'm tempted to explain the history reference. For anyone who's not familiar, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure I'm correct on this. The Rubicon is the river that Caesar crossed that marked like I am now taking the army into Rome. That was the point of like of absolute no return. He had crossed, and it was either he was going to take over or he was going to be put to death. Like those were the two options at that point. Well, so because I've had this conversation recently with a gentleman in our congregation who he gets frustrated because in the congregation there is what I think would be fair to describe as a lack of reverence. There are people who are making coffee and eating and going outside and and all these other things while the service is going on, or even doing something like where they're sitting, they have something. And I know there's a balance between, and we have bathrooms that are just in the back of the room we use, and when those toilets flush, everyone in the room very much knows that a toilet just flushed. And with all of that, there is a balance where, like, if you have to go to the bathroom, you have to go to the bathroom, especially for an hour-long service. Um, Coffee, there is less of an argument, I think, for you have to have your coffee right now in the middle of the service, or whatever else you're doing, that it has to take place right then and there. But the reality is, a lot of those things you wouldn't catch people doing during the national anthem. I mean, I guess I'm not at concession stands very often during the national anthem, but like people stop what they're doing for the national anthem. And
Unless a like hot dog is about to explode and shoot like searing
right.
hot grease onto somebody, most of the people in the concession stand stop too.
Well, and I think there's a fair point of, like, there are certain things that they just need to happen. And like if you work at a stadium, like you're especially if you work behind the scenes, you're probably not stopping for the national anthem. Which kind of, I mean, if we're asking for that same level of reverence in a service, yeah, there are things that need to get taken care of. And there, especially for people who are kind of working or even if volunteering on a Sunday morning, there are certain things that need to get taken care of. But if you were to say that here are expectations for reverence and worship, or I shouldn't say if you, if I were to say, here are expectations for reverence and worship, you're going to show up on time. You're going to be dressed in a way that is respectful to what we're doing. You are going to actually pay attention through the whole service. You're going to sing with the songs and engage with the service, and that is going to be your sole focus for an hour. Your donuts, your coffee, your everything else is going to wait till after the service, or you get here early and take care of it before the service. If I were to say that, the response I suspect would be something along the lines of, like, what are you doing? Why are you being such a stickler about this stuff? Like, isn't what really matters just that we're here and we're hearing the gospel and we're being in this community? And there's some truth to that, but the reality is, now that Ben's pointed this comparison out, I can't unsee that we take our reverence for the flag more seriously than we take reverence during worship. And I'm gonna hold that against you, Ben, because that's gonna bother me now.
Mm-hmm.
Like every time I'm at a hockey game and they do the national anthem, I'm gonna look around and I'm gonna be like, people are being more respectful here than sometimes happens. And for those of you in my congregation, right, I'm not trying to put anybody on blast, but there is a reality that sometimes some of us are less focused than we should be, or are less, let's use the word, reverent than we should be. Yeah, when you get into those comparisons between country and religion, it's kind of crazy to think about. Because I think for most Christians, if you were to ask, what is more important, your faith in Jesus Christ or the United States of America? I hope this isn't just me being an idealist. I hope most of them would say my faith in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But do our actions reflect that? Not to open the cans of worms that he does. But there's a rapper, I think it's KB, who does, he's a Christian rapper, and he has a line, it's, yes, I love my neighbor more than I love his papers. And what he's drawing attention to is, like, my concern for my neighbor is more important to me than his citizenship.
I think in general, it's probably Josh and I in seminary faced this question in a number of our classes. Like, what is your responsibility and to whom when you're given the or like given the choice between honoring the civil authorities in your life and your neighbor? And the
Oh,
immediate
I looked up the line. It's yes, I love the kingdom more than I love my nation. Yes, I love my neighbor more than I love his papers. Continue.
anyway, the the answer was pretty much always what is in greater proximity to you? What is closer to you? Um, if you are an agent of the government, if you work in law enforcement, if you work in the halls of Congress, if you are on your local planning commission, whatever the case may be, you're much you're much closer in that specific circumstance to government than most people. Um, and this may not apply quite as directly to you,
Right.
but for the majority of us who don't work in local government and don't work in law enforcement, our primary concern is not our government, it's our neighbor. And what that means to me is, let's start with a silly example. Um, my neighbor goes like 3 weeks without mowing their lawn. Suddenly it's in violation of, what are they called?
The
Municipal
HOA.
code. No, we don't have an HOA. It's just in violation of city code. Um, and so we could call code enforcement on them. They could get fined and forced to pay somebody to mow their lawn. Well, if I went over there and like figured out why the lawn wasn't mowed, maybe they broke a hip at work a couple weeks ago. Maybe I bust out my lawnmower and I go mow it for them because my neighbor is more important than my government.
Yeah.
And you can grow that considerably to the lyric that Josh is speaking to. Um, there are a number of people in this country who are not here through perfectly legal means, but a lot of them are here because they are running from real things.
Yeah.
Um, and
And
if we don't know who those neighbors are before we involve our government in whatever is going to happen, we may end up causing more damage than we'd hope.
yeah.
I had a couple of cousins. One of them, I think, still works for this organization. Can't remember the name of the group off the top of my head, but it's an organization out of Chicago that works with kids in the immigration system, especially kids in the immigration system who don't have anywhere to go within the states as they wait for asylum cases. Um, and they heard just story after story after story of, you know, someone in my family or someone in my neighborhood got brutally murdered by a cartel or um, a local warlord or whatever the case may be. And my family is here because we don't want to be the next one. Or my family sent me here to live with a very distant relative because they didn't want me to be the next one. Um, and that I think it's important for us to understand that that story is a lot more common than we maybe give it credit for. And by putting government ahead of neighbor, I think we can sometimes miss those stories and miss our honestly more important calling to serve those neighbors rather than serve our government.
Yeah. And we, I mean, and as best as we are able, we are called to do both. We are
Yes.
called to uphold the
Yeah,
law. We are
absolutely.
called to be good citizens. Which kind of circles back to like patriotism is appropriate, right? Uh,
Sometimes.
sometimes. Well, I think with I'm operating with the definition where patriotism uh, is like patriotism stops when nationalism starts. And if you're drawing a distinction like that, um, I'm comfortable saying patriotism is fine. Nationalism is it's when the nation has become an idol
That's
instead of
fair.
something I appreciate. So like
Patriotism is the cheerleader. Nationalism is the all in, sold out, over the top.
the fanboy. Um, so because like there's a lot to celebrate in this country. The standard of living here, it's by world standards is phenomenal, right? We're incredibly blessed. We have an abundance of a lot of resources. It's like our country is a great place to live, and we have a lot to be thankful for. And on July 4th, we kind of set this day aside to be thankful for our country, and it's entirely appropriate to thank God for the freedoms we have, for the place we get to live, for all of the benefits that come with that.
Mhm.
So that is appropriate, and to have a Fourth of July party, great. That's I see nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's a great opportunity to give thanks to God for the gifts that He has given us through the country.
Mhm.
The thing we just have to steer clear of is the country should not be an idol.
Mhm.
You should never fear or love or trust the country more than you fear, love, and trust God.
Mhm.
Um, and to circle back to the Pledge of Allegiance, when the values of the country come in conflict with the values of the faith, one of those is the correct way to go, and it's not the country, right?
Mhm.
Um,
One thing that I think causes this to be a bigger issue than we maybe want it to be is around service in the armed forces. Um, it's the military does great job marketing that you are serving your country, um, and to an extent you are, right. When somebody joins the military and they go into battle, they put their nation's flag on their shoulder or on their chest, um, or on their helmet, depending on what branch and what uniform you're given. Um, and you serve as a part of the armed forces of that country. Um, and our country has done a pretty good job of honoring those people. Maybe not necessarily always of supporting them, but certainly of honoring them. We have specific days for the people who've passed as a part of their armed or their service in the armed forces. We have another day for those who've retired from the armed forces, and we have another one for those actively serving in the armed forces. Um, but I think I'd be curious. I genuinely don't know what the answer to this is. I'd be curious to what extent the people that serve in the armed forces are getting into it out of a sense of duty and pride to their country, and how many of them are doing it out of a sense of duty and pride to serve their neighbors and their family. Um,
and I think the same can be said for a lot of public service. Um, Another
mhm,
example would be police officers. And I know we have one officer in our and my apologies because I don't remember what rank he is. I don't know if officer is even the right term. Um, but he serves in the police force, and I've talked to him about it. And the reason that he does that is to protect and serve the people of the community. Um, and if that is the reason you're stepping into a line of work like that, that is entirely in line with our faith.
Mhm,
When it is to protect and serve our neighbors.
mhm.
Um,
I mean,
and I
honestly,
think the same thing could be
any,
said for any role of, like, if you're stepping
yeah,
into the political arena, if you're
mhm.
doing it to serve your neighbor and to help guide the country in faithful decisions, by all means, I will pray for you. If you're doing it for power or because you have a particular agenda you want to get through,
I
um,
will still pray for you, but maybe something very
in a
different.
different way, maybe that your heart gets changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Another example, public school teachers. Um, your desire is to educate the people in our community, and you're going to do so in a faithful way. And I love that. Um, that is an incredible calling that God puts on some people's hearts. Um, but if you're doing it because you want good citizens of the United States, like I don't know if I know anyone that that's necessarily a problem for, but like I guess it could be somewhere. Um, but yeah, I mean,
Well, and even that, I think it depends on how you define good citizen. If you define good citizen as someone who serves their community and is responsible with, like, I'm like, they're consistent. Maybe the reasoning is a little off, but like that's still a faithful pursuit.
yeah. I do know some teachers who are like, I just want good neighbors. Like I want educated, like kind, humble neighbors. And I'm like,
Same.
you know what? That's I dig that. I dig that. Um, but like on yeah, on the flips, if you're trying to just indoctrinate kids to become a good American, like I don't like I said, I don't know if I know any of these, but like don't.
Yeah, the only thing that really we should indoctrinate kids with is doctrine of the church, of like faithful theology.
Yeah.
Like if you ask me what do I do when it comes to middle school catechesis, I am trying to indoctrinate kids. I am trying to teach them the doctrine of the church. Like that. And if anyone's listening to this, they're like, pastor's trying to indoctrinate kids. Yeah, I'm trying to indoctrinate adults too. So like if you didn't know that, now you know that. I'm not.
Not gonna hide this from you.
Yeah, it's like it's actually a major part of my job. The calling of the church is to make disciples, which is indoctrinating people.
Yeah.
So you're trying to indoctrinate your faith, and I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying
So
to do.
here's a thought that I just had that I
Dangerous.
think is relevant. This is dangerous. So you talked about the purpose of the church, at least is in part to create disciples.
Yes.
We just started a Bible study here a couple weeks ago, looking at what it really means to be a disciple. Um, in the first week, we took a look at just what a disciple was in that day and time. Um, and there were three pieces of the definition. One, a student, you're going to learn. You're going to good stuff's going to happen and go in your brain. Um, two, you're called to be an imitator. So like disciples would fully imitate the life of the person that they were following. They would eat the same things, they would fall into the same habits of sleeping and studying. Um, you were trying to make your life look as close as possible to the one you were imitating. And three, you wanted to be something like an apprentice. That is, you wanted to gain the skills necessary to the point where you would become a master you would become a teacher and you would gain your own disciples. As disciples of Christ, our call then is to learn as much as we can about his teaching, what he wants for us, aka doctrine. So it is good to indoctrinate ourselves. Uh, Two, we're then called to imitate him as much as is possible. Um,
Yeah, you're not going to get magic Healy powers,
yeah,
which is not a great way to describe those, but
yeah. I was gonna say maybe we should go with divine healing powers. Um,
divine Healy powers.
okay.
Don't get formal on me, Benjamin.
Now I'm just imagining some kid with a halo and angel wings flying through a mall in Heelys. Um, for those of you who don't know what Heelys are, they're shoes with built-in wheels so that you can kind
Educate
of like,
yourself.
yeah, so that you can severely injure yourself. Um, anyway, um, and then lastly, we're called to be apprentices, which we're never truly going to become masters as disciples of Christ because
The
you
standards
can't.
are high.
You can't. You can't. So we're always going to be in the apprentice stage, but we want to do as best we can to get like close, um, because that's our calling. Um,
As Lowe's says, never stop improving.
yeah, or as Paul says, to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Or die trying, which is what we're all gonna do.
Yes, exactly. But if we apply that same metric to being an American, which one are you putting more effort into? And could there be some idolatry there?
Yeah. And I think for most of our listeners, you're probably in a good place. Like of the people I know who listen to this podcast, right? I would classify most, if not all of you, as patriotic, but not uh nationalistic, not idolizing the nation, but appreciating it, which I think is a good place to land. But it's worth thinking about, like that reverence to the flag versus reverence in church that's going to live rent free in my head. Like that's worth thinking about. Because what are the things we do without really thinking about them? What do they communicate, regardless of what the intentions are? So,
Mhm.
um, unless you have anything else, that seems as good a place as any to start to wrap up a little bit.
I think I think I'm good there. Um,
You got a takeaway for us?
Not really, more so like a note. Um, Use this 4th of July as an opportunity to pray for a lot of things happening in our country. Um, Pray for our leaders, pray for those who serve. Um, Government jobs, unless you're like in the halls of Congress or president, they're not very cushy most times, and kind of thankless. So, um, pray a prayer of thanks for those who are willing to use their talents to serve in the public sector rather than um, making bank. Um, Pray for those who uh, serve our communities, whether it be in emergency services, in the armed forces, in um, whatever other roles are around, trash collectors, those who work for the utilities. Like, there are so many things that people do that are just kind of under the surface that we don't necessarily give credit for. And then lastly, pray for the leadership of this country, whether you like them or not. And like, pray that God faithfully uses them, whether or not you like them.
Yeah. My takeaway is actually kind of in a similar vein, and that
That
is,
wasn't even my takeaway. That was just a
oh,
note.
well, I'm going to jump off with my takeaway,
Go for it.
and that is reframe the 4th of July as not just appreciation to your country or a celebration of your country, but an appreciation and a celebration for God's gifts in the form of the country that we get to live in together.
Mhm.
And it sounds kind of like just a word game shift, but I think it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile saying I'm gonna light off this firework in a responsible and sober way to to celebrate God's gifts here in the United States of America. America.
MURICA. Um, I think my takeaway is what are you a disciple of? Like, what are you doing a better job learning from, being an imitator of, being an apprentice to the United States or Jesus?
And if you
Um,
really want to pull out your hair and you want to really think about what's discipling you, read Desiring the Kingdom by James K. A. Smith.
yeah, and then when your brain has melted out your nose and onto the table in front of you, scoop it back into a tray, go see your local neurologist before coming to see us, your pastor. Just want to make sure that there's something left for us to actually work with when we have that conversation with you.
Yeah. Also, I would be an advocate. Read the first half of the book and just don't bother with the second half
Yeah,
because his reasoning is really good, and then he draws conclusions that I'm like, you jumped a whole bunch of steps.
yeah,
You should
that's accurate.
anyway.
That's accurate.
Um,
If you get through the first chapter, I'll be proud of you. You
yeah,
can leave it there.
it's interesting.
Um, onto the passive aggressive part of the show. Uh,
Yay!
if
A big
someone you
messy
know
boy.
is possibly struggling with this, um, send them this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen with as open a mind as possible. Um, because we think that this is a real problem that exists in our world. It's not everybody everywhere, but
There
it's
are a
there.
few, and they're loud.
Yeah.
Alternatively, send this podcast to someone who needs a reminder that you should not light fireworks while intoxicated. And if you're listening to this and you got this far and you need that reminder, this is officially your reminder. Don't light fireworks off if you're intoxicated. Thank you.
Yeah. You don't want to become Jason Pierre-Paul.
Yeah, although he continued to have an NFL career, so
Yeah.
he did all right after the fact. In any case, please like, follow, subscribe, share, what all that stuff that we're supposed to plug at the end of podcasts. A more exciting thing to plug: if you would like a Man Buns and Jesus shirt, you can now purchase a Man Buns and Jesus shirt. You go to edgewaterlutheran.org/gear, and it is one of the options on that page, and it has our faces silhouetted on the front, and on the back it says Man Buns and Jesus in my favorite podcast. So I'm wearing the host faces on my shirt. It is supposed to be ridiculous. That was the goal, and that's why also it is the nicest t-shirt I could print it on, which does mean that it costs almost $30. um, but if you really like Man Buns and Jesus, like really, really like it, by all means, buy the shirt. And if you do buy the shirt, please send our Facebook page a picture of you wearing it, because I will laugh for a week straight that someone purchased and wore a Man Buns and Jesus shirt. Um, okay, we're done. We're done. Go in peace and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.